Patrick Henry was a Virginia lawyer and orator whose fiery words helped ignite the American Revolution. Patrick Henry, one of America's most influential founding fathers, was born on May 29, 1736 in Studley, Hanover County, Virginia. He came from a modest but respectable family. His father was a Scottish immigrant and a planter. Henry had a commanding presence when he spoke. His early business ventures were unsuccessful. He was largely self-educated and tried his hand at farming and storekeeping, but both enterprises failed. Then in 1760, after just 6 weeks of legal study, the 24-year-old Henry obtained his law license and began practicing law in the Virginia courts. Patrick Henry was not born into wealth or privilege. He had to make his own way in the world through his natural talents and his gift for public speaking. In 1763, Henry gained widespread fame with his argument in the Parsons Cause case. He challenged the authority of the British Crown to override Virginia law. Henry argued that a king who would veto beneficial colonial legislation forfeited the right to his subjects' obedience. This was radical thinking for the time. The case made Henry's reputation as a defender of colonial rights and a brilliant courtroom advocate. In 1765, Henry was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses. Within days of taking his seat, he introduced the Virginia Resolves opposing the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was Britain's attempt to tax the American colonies directly. Henry's resolves declared that only Virginia's colonial assembly had the right to tax Virginians. When Henry presented his resolves, he gave a passionate speech. Some witnesses reported that he said, "Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, and George III." At this point, cries of treason interrupted him. Henry supposedly concluded, "May profit by their example. If this be treason, make the most of it." Patrick Henry was becoming known as one of the most radical voices in the colonies. He was not a man who minced words or sought compromise when he believed fundamental principles were at stake. His Virginia resolves were printed in newspapers throughout the colonies and helped spark widespread resistance to the Stamp Act. Other colonial assemblies passed similar resolutions. The Stamp Act was eventually repealed, and Henry's role in that victory made him a colonial hero. Henry continued to serve in the House of Burgesses throughout the late 1760s and early 1770s. He consistently opposed British policies that he saw as infringing on colonial liberties. He was a member of the Committees of Correspondence that helped coordinate resistance among the colonies. Unlike some of the other founding fathers, Henry was not a wealthy plantation owner or a Boston merchant. He was a self-made lawyer who spoke for the common people. His oratory style was emotional and direct, appealing to the hearts of his listeners. In 1774, Henry was elected as a delegate to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. There he met other colonial leaders like John Adams, Samuel Adams, and George Washington. Henry made a strong impression on his fellow delegates. John Adams later wrote that Henry was the completest speaker I ever heard. At the Congress, Henry famously declared, "The distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American." This statement showed Henry's vision of a unified American nation, not just separate colonies. The situation between Britain and the colonies continued to deteriorate. In March 1775, Henry attended the Second Virginia Convention in Richmond. The convention was debating whether Virginia should prepare for military action against Britain. Many delegates favored a more cautious approach, hoping for reconciliation. Patrick Henry had no such illusions. He believed that war was inevitable and that Virginia needed to prepare its militia immediately. On March 23, 1775, Henry rose to speak in favor of arming the Virginia militia. What followed was perhaps the most famous speech in American history. Henry began by acknowledging the gravity of the situation and the different opinions in the room. He said he had to speak his mind, no matter the personal cost. Henry reviewed the history of colonial attempts to reconcile with Britain. He pointed out that all petitions had been met with violence and insult. He argued that the colonies had done everything possible to avoid conflict, but Britain had responded by sending troops and warships. Patrick Henry told the delegates that they should not deceive themselves. The war had already begun. The next gale from the north would bring the clash of arms to Virginia. He asked what the colonists had to fight with if they delayed preparation. Would they be stronger in a year? Would British forces be weaker? He argued that the colonies would never be stronger than they were at that moment. Delay would only weaken their position. Henry addressed those who hoped for peace. He said there was no peace. The war had already started. Their brethren in the north were already in the field. He asked why the delegates should stand idle. What did they wish? What would they have? He declared that life was so dear and peace so sweet that they should be purchased at the price of chains and slavery. Then came the immortal words that would echo through American history, "Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." The effect of Henry's speech was electric. Witnesses reported that the audience sat in stunned silence, then erupted in approval. The convention voted to arm the Virginia militia. Less than a month later, on April 19, 1775, the Revolutionary War began with the battles of Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. Patrick Henry's words had helped prepare Virginia and the colonies for the conflict that was to come. His speech became a rallying cry for the Revolution. In August 1775, Henry was appointed commander of Virginia's colonial forces. He was not a professional soldier like George Washington. His military service was brief and not particularly distinguished. Henry's talents lay in politics and oratory, not military command. In 1776, he resigned his military commission and was elected as the first governor of the independent Commonwealth of Virginia. He served 3 one-year terms as governor from 1776 to 1779. During his governorship, Henry worked to support the war effort and establish the new state government. Patrick Henry was a strong supporter of independence and individual liberty. However, he was also a complicated figure. Like George Washington and many other Virginia leaders, Henry was a slaveholder. He owned slaves throughout his life, though he expressed discomfort with the institution. He once wrote that slavery was as repugnant to humanity as it is inconsistent with the Bible and destructive to liberty. Yet he continued to own slaves and did not free them during his lifetime. This contradiction between his words about liberty and his actions regarding slavery troubled Henry himself and troubles historians today. After his first stint as governor, Henry returned to the House of Delegates. He continued to be a powerful voice in Virginia politics. In 1784, he was elected governor again, serving 2 more one-year terms. During this period, Henry advocated for religious freedom and supported the separation of church and state. He initially opposed Thomas Jefferson's statute for religious freedom, favoring instead a general tax to support all Christian denominations. However, James Madison's arguments eventually prevailed, and Virginia adopted Jefferson's more radical approach. In 1787, the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia to draft a new framework for the national government. Patrick Henry was elected as a delegate but refused to attend. He said he'd smelt a rat in Philadelphia, tending toward the monarchy. Henry was deeply suspicious of centralized power. He feared that a strong national government would threaten individual liberties and states' rights. When the proposed constitution was presented to the states for ratification, Henry became one of its most vocal opponents. Patrick Henry was the leading anti-federalist in Virginia. He believed the Constitution gave too much power to the federal government at the expense of the states. He feared that the president could become a tyrant. He worried that Congress would abuse its taxation powers. He was particularly concerned that the Constitution, as originally written, contained no Bill of Rights to protect individual liberties. At the Virginia Ratifying Convention in 1788, Henry gave speech after speech opposing ratification. Henry's oratory at the Ratifying Convention was as powerful as ever. He spoke for hours, painting vivid pictures of the dangers he saw in the Constitution. He asked his fellow Virginians to consider what they were giving up. He warned that the new government could destroy the liberties they had fought a revolution to secure. He argued that the Constitution should be amended before ratification, not after. His speeches were so effective that the outcome of the Virginia Convention was in doubt until the very end. James Madison, Edmund Randolph, and other Federalists defended the Constitution. They argued that a stronger national government was necessary to hold the young nation together. They promised that a Bill of Rights would be added through the amendment process once the Constitution was ratified. George Washington's support for the Constitution also carried great weight in Virginia. In the end, Virginia ratified the Constitution by a narrow vote of 89 to 79. Patrick Henry had lost the battle, but his opposition helped ensure that a Bill of Rights would be added to the Constitution. Henry's insistence on a Bill of Rights was perhaps his greatest contribution to American government. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution, ratified in 1791, protected freedom of speech, religion, the press, and assembly. They guaranteed the right to bear arms and to trial by jury. They protected against unreasonable searches and seizures and cruel and unusual punishment. These protections reflected many of the concerns Henry had raised during the ratification debates. Without Henry's opposition, the Bill of Rights might never have been adopted. After the Constitution was ratified, Henry retired from public life for a time. He returned to his law practice and his family. Henry had been married twice and fathered 17 children. His first wife, Sarah Shelton, whom he married in 1754, died in 1775 after a long illness. In 1777, he married Dorothea Dandridge, a wealthy widow. Henry's law practice flourished in the 1790s. He became one of the most successful and highly paid lawyers in Virginia. He represented clients in important cases throughout the state. Patrick Henry remained a respected elder statesman. Both Federalists and Democratic Republicans sought his support. President Washington offered Henry positions as Secretary of State, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and Minister to Spain, but Henry declined all these appointments. He preferred to remain in Virginia with his family. However, Henry did not completely withdraw from politics. He continued to speak out on issues he cared about. In the late 1790s, Henry became alarmed by what he saw as the excesses of the Democratic-Republican Party. He was particularly troubled by the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which claimed that states could nullify federal laws they deemed unconstitutional. These resolutions were written by Madison and Jefferson in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts. Henry believed the resolutions went too far and threatened the Union. In his final years, he moved closer to the Federalist position, supporting a strong national government to preserve the Union. In 1799, Patrick Henry was persuaded to run for the Virginia House of Delegates one more time. At 63, he was in declining health, but he felt compelled to oppose the Virginia resolutions and defend the Union. He campaigned in the spring of 1799, giving speeches despite his physical weakness. In one of his last public speeches, Henry warned against the dangers of disunion. He said that the Union must be preserved and that Virginians should support the federal government. He won election but never took his seat. On June 6, 1799, Patrick Henry died at his estate, Red Hill, in Charlotte County, Virginia. He was 63 years old. His death was mourned throughout the nation. Newspapers praised his contributions to American independence and liberty. His liberty or death speech was already legendary. Henry was remembered as one of the great voices of the Revolution, a man whose words had inspired a nation to fight for freedom. Patrick Henry's legacy is complex and enduring. He was not a political theorist like Jefferson or Madison. He did not command armies like Washington. He did not help draft the Constitution. What Henry contributed was his voice. His passionate oratory moved people to action. His words at the Virginia Convention in 1775 helped push the colonies toward revolution. His opposition to the Constitution helped secure the Bill of Rights. His defense of individual liberty and limited government influenced American political thought for generations. Henry was a man of contradictions. He spoke eloquently of liberty while owning slaves. He opposed centralized power but supported the Union. He was a radical revolutionary who became more conservative in his later years. These contradictions make him a more human and more interesting historical figure. He was not a marble statue but a real person struggling with the great questions of his time. Patrick Henry believed that liberty was worth any sacrifice. He believed that individuals should be free to govern themselves and that government power should be limited. He believed that rights came from God, not from government, and that those rights should be protected. These beliefs were at the heart of the American Revolution and remain central to American political culture today. When Americans debate the proper role of government, the balance between federal and state power, and the protection of individual rights, they are continuing arguments that Patrick Henry helped to frame. In death, Patrick Henry was remembered as the voice of the Revolution. His words had helped birth a nation. His insistence on protecting individual liberty had helped shape the Constitution through the Bill of Rights. He remains one of the most quotable of the Founding Fathers. "Give me liberty or give me death" continues to resonate as a statement of the American commitment to freedom. Patrick Henry was, in life and in memory, the orator who spoke for liberty. Paul Revere was a Boston silversmith and patriot who became one of the most celebrated heroes of the American Revolution. Paul Revere, the legendary Midnight Rider, was born in Boston, Massachusetts on January 1, 1735. He came from a family of artisans. His father, Apollos Rivoire, was a French Huguenot immigrant who had fled religious persecution in France and established himself as a goldsmith in Boston's North End. Young Paul learned the craft of metalworking from his father, developing skills that would sustain him throughout his life. Revere received a basic education in reading and writing at the North Writing School. He was apprenticed to his father at age 13, learning the intricate art of silversmithing. The work required precision, patience, and an artistic eye. Paul showed natural talent with his hands, creating beautiful objects from precious metals. When his father died in 1754, the 19-year-old Paul inherited the family business. He anglicized his name from Rivoire to Revere, making it easier for his English-speaking customers to pronounce and remember. In 1756, Revere served briefly in the French and Indian War, participating in a failed military expedition to Lake George in New York. The experience gave him his first taste of military life, though he saw little actual combat. After returning to Boston, he married Sarah Orne in August 1757. Sarah came from a respectable Boston family, and together they would have 8 children. Revere worked tirelessly at his trade to support his growing family, establishing himself as one of Boston's finest silversmiths. Paul Revere was more than just a craftsman. He was an engraver, a dentist, a maker of surgical instruments, and later a manufacturer of bells and cannons. His versatility was remarkable. He created everything from silver teapots and tankards to false teeth and copper engravings. His shop on Fish Street became known throughout Boston for quality workmanship. Revere's engravings appeared in books and newspapers, spreading his reputation beyond the silversmith trade. He had an entrepreneurial spirit, always seeking new opportunities to expand his business and support his family. Boston in the 1760s was a city in turmoil. The British Parliament began imposing new taxes on the American colonies to pay for the French and Indian War. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Acts created growing resentment among colonists who believed they should not be taxed without representation in Parliament. Paul Revere became increasingly involved in the resistance movement. He joined the Sons of Liberty, a secret organization dedicated to protecting colonial rights and opposing British tyranny. Revere used his skills as an engraver to create powerful propaganda for the Patriot cause. In 1770, after British soldiers fired into a crowd of colonists in what became known as the Boston Massacre, Revere created an engraving depicting the event. His image showed British soldiers deliberately shooting into a peaceful crowd of citizens. The engraving was not entirely accurate, but it was effective propaganda. Copies spread throughout the colonies, inflaming public opinion against the British. Revere understood the power of images to shape public perception and rally support for the Patriot cause. Sarah Revere died in 1773, leaving Paul a widower with 8 children. Several months later he married Rachel Walker, and they would eventually have 8 more children together. Rachel proved to be a capable partner, managing the household while Paul devoted increasing amounts of time to political activities. The Revere home became a gathering place for patriots discussing resistance to British rule. In December 1773, Revere participated in the Boston Tea Party. Disguised as Mohawk Indians, he and other Sons of Liberty members boarded British ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 45 tons of tea into the water. The action was a protest against the Tea Act, which gave the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. Revere later said he helped destroy the tea because the colonists would not allow themselves to be enslaved by British taxation policies. The British response to the Boston Tea Party was swift and harsh. Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, which colonists called the Intolerable Acts. These laws closed Boston Harbor, restricted town meetings, and placed Massachusetts under military rule. British troops occupied Boston in force. The city became an armed camp, with redcoats patrolling the streets and tensions rising daily between soldiers and citizens. Paul Revere became a key member of the Patriot intelligence network. He was a trusted courier, carrying messages between Patriot leaders in Boston and other colonial cities. He rode to New York and Philadelphia multiple times, delivering letters and gathering information about British activities. Revere was reliable, discreet, and brave. The Patriots trusted him with their most sensitive communications. He knew the roads, he had contacts throughout New England, and he was willing to ride through any weather at any hour. In the fall of 1774, Revere made several rides to warn Patriots that British troops were planning to seize colonial military supplies. He rode to Portsmouth, New Hampshire to alert Patriots there that British forces were coming. He rode to warn communities around Boston when British troops ventured out on training exercises. Each ride built his reputation as a reliable messenger who could be counted on in a crisis. By April 1775, Boston was a powder keg ready to explode. British General Thomas Gage commanded thousands of troops in the city. Patriot leaders John Hancock and Samuel Adams were in Lexington, just outside Boston. The Patriots had stockpiled weapons and ammunition in Concord, about 20 miles from Boston. British intelligence knew about these supplies, and Gage was under orders from London to arrest the rebel leaders and seize the military stores. The Patriots had established a warning system to alert the countryside if British troops marched out of Boston. Paul Revere and William Dawes were designated as messengers. They arranged signals to be hung in the steeple of the Old North Church. One lantern would mean the British were coming by land across Boston Neck. 2 lanterns would mean they were crossing the Charles River by boat. The signal would allow Patriots on the other side of the river to begin spreading the alarm even before the messengers could cross. On the evening of April 18, 1775, Paul Revere learned that British troops were preparing to march. Around 10 o'clock that night, he arranged for 2 lanterns to be hung in the Old North Church steeple. Then he slipped out of Boston, rowing across the Charles River with muffled oars to avoid British patrol boats. A British warship was anchored nearby, and Revere and his companions had to row silently through the darkness to avoid detection. They landed in Charlestown, where Patriot friends had a horse waiting. Paul Revere mounted and began his famous midnight ride. He galloped through the night, stopping at houses along the way to warn that the British regulars were coming out. He spread the alarm through Medford, through Menotomy, riding hard for Lexington where Hancock and Adams were staying. William Dawes took a different route, also spreading the warning. The countryside began to come alive as Minutemen grabbed their muskets and prepared to defend their communities. Revere reached Lexington around midnight and warned Hancock and Adams. He was joined by William Dawes, and together with Samuel Prescott, a local doctor, they set out for Concord to warn Patriots there. But along the road, British officers on patrol stopped them. Prescott jumped his horse over a stone wall and escaped to carry the warning to Concord. Dawes also escaped, though he was thrown from his horse. Paul Revere was captured by the British officers. The British questioned Revere roughly, demanding to know what he was doing on the road at night. Revere boldly told them he had been warning the countryside that British troops were coming, and that 500 Minutemen would soon be assembled. The British officers heard gunfire in the distance from Lexington and became alarmed. They confiscated Revere's horse and released him on foot. Revere walked back to Lexington, arriving just as the battle began on Lexington Green. On the morning of April 19, 1775, British troops confronted about 70 Minutemen on Lexington Green. Someone fired a shot, and then both sides opened fire. 8 colonists were killed and 10 wounded. The British marched on to Concord, where they searched for military supplies. At the North Bridge in Concord, Minutemen and British troops exchanged fire in what Ralph Waldo Emerson would later call the shot heard round the world. The Revolutionary War had begun. The British troops began their march back to Boston, and it became a nightmare. Thousands of militiamen had assembled from surrounding towns. They fired on the British column from behind stone walls, trees, and buildings. The British suffered heavy casualties during the fighting retreat. Paul Revere's midnight ride had succeeded in alerting the countryside, allowing the Patriots to mobilize and confront the British forces. Revere returned to his family in Boston, but the city was now under siege by Patriot forces. In April 1775 he was sent to Philadelphia to report on the battles at Lexington and Concord to the Continental Congress. He continued to serve as a courier and messenger for the Patriot cause. When the British evacuated Boston in March 1776, Revere and his family were able to resume a more normal life. During the Revolutionary War, Paul Revere served the Patriot cause in various ways. He designed and printed the first issue of Continental currency. He learned to manufacture gunpowder at a mill in Canton, Massachusetts. He was commissioned as a lieutenant colonel in the Massachusetts militia. In 1779 he commanded the artillery in the disastrous Penobscot expedition, a failed attempt to drive the British from Maine. The expedition ended in complete defeat, and Revere was accused of insubordination and cowardice. He demanded a court-martial to clear his name, and in 1782 he was acquitted of all charges. After the war, Paul Revere returned to his business pursuits with renewed energy. He expanded his silversmith shop and opened a hardware store. He imported goods from England and sold them to Boston merchants. In 1788 he opened a foundry for casting bells and cannons. His foundry produced over 200 bells that were installed in churches throughout New England. The bells of Paul Revere had a distinctive sweet tone that made them highly prized. Revere pioneered the manufacture of copper products in America. In 1800 he opened a copper rolling mill in Canton, Massachusetts. The mill produced copper sheeting for various purposes, including the hull of the USS Constitution, the famous warship known as Old Ironsides. Revere's copper mill also produced copper for the dome of the Massachusetts State House. His business ventures made him wealthy and respected as an industrialist and innovator. Paul Revere was active in civic affairs throughout his life. He was a founding member of the Massachusetts Charitable Mechanic Association, which supported artisans and craftsmen. He served as a Freemason and eventually became Grand Master of the Masonic Grand Lodge of Massachusetts. He was involved in various charitable organizations and supported education and public improvements in Boston. Revere believed in community service and used his wealth and influence to benefit others. As Revere grew older, his fame from the midnight ride began to fade from public memory. The events of April 18, 1775 were remembered, but Revere's role was not particularly emphasized. He was known more as a successful businessman and respected citizen than as a Revolutionary War hero. Revere himself rarely spoke about his famous ride, focusing instead on his family and business interests. Rachel Revere died in 1813, and Paul was left a widower for the second time. He was 78 years old and had outlived many of his Revolutionary War contemporaries. He continued to work at his businesses, though he gradually turned over daily operations to his sons. The Revere Copper Mill remained a family enterprise, and several of his children became successful in their own right. On May 10, 1818, Paul Revere died at his home in Boston at the age of 83. He was buried in the Granary Burying Ground alongside other patriots including Samuel Adams and the victims of the Boston Massacre. His death was noted in Boston newspapers, but he was remembered primarily as a respected craftsman and businessman, not as the legendary hero he would later become. It was not until decades after his death that Paul Revere achieved his iconic status in American history. In 1861, the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow published a poem called Paul Revere's Ride. The poem dramatically recounted the events of April 18, 1775, beginning with the famous lines about 1 if by land and 2 if by sea. Longfellow's poem was not entirely historically accurate, but it captured the public imagination. It was published just as the Civil War was beginning, and it served to remind Americans of their revolutionary heritage and the courage of those who fought for independence. Longfellow's poem made Paul Revere a household name and transformed him into an American folk hero. The image of the Lone Rider galloping through the night to warn of British invasion became one of the most enduring symbols of the American Revolution. School children memorized the poem, and Revere's Midnight Ride became one of the most famous events in American history. The poem overshadowed Revere's many other accomplishments and contributions, but it ensured that his name would be remembered for generations. Paul Revere's legacy extends far beyond his famous ride. He was a skilled artisan whose silverwork is displayed in museums and prized by collectors. He was an innovative industrialist who helped establish American manufacturing. He was a dedicated patriot who risked his life repeatedly for the cause of independence. He was a family man who raised 16 children and provided for them through hard work and business acumen. He was a community leader who contributed to civic improvements and charitable causes. The Midnight Ride itself, while dramatic and important, was just one night in a long life of service and achievement. Revere's real significance lies in his representation of the ordinary citizens who became revolutionaries. He was not a wealthy planter like Washington or an intellectual like Jefferson. He was a working man, a craftsman who used his skills and courage to support the fight for American independence. He embodied the democratic spirit of the Revolution, the idea that ordinary people could change the course of history through their actions and dedication to principle. Today, Paul Revere is remembered as one of the great heroes of the American Revolution. His house in Boston's North End is a museum visited by thousands each year. His silverwork is treasured as examples of American craftsmanship at its finest. His Midnight Ride is commemorated in paintings, statues, and monuments throughout New England. The Old North Church where the signal lanterns were hung still stands as a reminder of that fateful night. Paul Revere's story continues to inspire Americans with its message of courage, patriotism, and individual initiative in the service of freedom and independence. Music. The Marquis de Lafayette was a French aristocrat and passionate idealist who became the hero of two worlds. Marie-Joseph Paul-Yves Roch Gilbert du Motier, Marquis de Lafayette, was born on September 6, 1757, in the province of Auvergne in south-central France. He came from one of the oldest and most distinguished families in France. Lafayette's family lineage traced back centuries through French nobility. His father, Michel Louis-Christophe Roch Gilbert Paulet du Motier, was a colonel in the French army who died at the Battle of Minden when Lafayette was only 2 years old. His mother, Marie-Louise Joly de la Rivière, died when he was 13, leaving the young Lafayette an orphan and an extraordinarily wealthy one. Lafayette inherited an immense fortune that made him one of the richest men in France. At the age of 14, he became a member of the prestigious Black Musketeers of the military household of King Louis XVI. Lafayette was trained in the traditions of French military service and courtly life. In 1774, at the age of 16, Lafayette married Adrienne de Noailles, a member of one of the most powerful families at the French court. The marriage connected Lafayette to the highest circles of French society and political power. Despite being arranged, the marriage would prove to be a loving partnership that lasted throughout their lives. Lafayette served as a junior officer in the French army, but he found peacetime military service boring and unfulfilling. He yearned for glory and adventure, for a cause that would give meaning to his privileged existence. In 1775, Lafayette heard about the American colonists' rebellion against British rule. The young aristocrat became fascinated with the American cause. He saw in the American Revolution the ideals of liberty and equality that resonated with his own beliefs. Lafayette was drawn to the revolutionary ideas of natural rights and representative government that the Americans were fighting to defend. The French government officially maintained neutrality in the conflict between Britain and its colonies, but many French officials secretly hoped the Americans would succeed in weakening their traditional enemy. In 1776, at a dinner party in Metz, Lafayette met the Duke of Gloucester, the brother of King George III of England, who spoke sympathetically about the American cause. That conversation ignited Lafayette's determination to join the American struggle for independence. Despite his youth and inexperience, Lafayette decided he would sail to America and offer his services to the Continental Army. Lafayette's family and the French court opposed his plan to join the American rebels. King Louis XVI officially forbade French officers from going to America. Lafayette's father-in-law threatened to have him arrested if he attempted to leave France. But Lafayette was determined. In December 1776, Lafayette met with Silas Deane, the American ambassador to France, who was recruiting French officers for the Continental Army. Deane promised Lafayette a commission as a major general. Lafayette used his own fortune to purchase a ship, which he named La Victoire, and loaded it with military supplies for the Americans. In April 1777, the 19-year-old Lafayette defied his king, his family, and the French authorities and sailed for America. He left behind his pregnant wife and his comfortable life at the French court to fight for a cause he believed in passionately. The voyage across the Atlantic took 7 weeks. Lafayette and his companions landed near Georgetown, South Carolina, in June 1777. From there, Lafayette traveled nearly 900 miles overland to Philadelphia, where the Continental Congress was meeting. He arrived in Philadelphia in July 1777, eager to join the fight for American independence. The Continental Congress was initially reluctant to grant Lafayette the commission that Silas Deane had promised. Congress had been flooded with French officers seeking high ranks and generous pay, and many had proven to be more trouble than they were worth. But Lafayette was different. He offered to serve without pay, asking only that he be allowed to volunteer his services to the American cause. Lafayette's sincerity, his enthusiasm, and his willingness to serve without compensation impressed the congressional delegates. In July 1777, Congress commissioned Lafayette as a major general in the Continental Army, though the appointment was initially honorary. Lafayette traveled to meet General George Washington, the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. The meeting between Washington and Lafayette marked the beginning of one of the most important friendships in American history. Despite their differences in age and background, Washington and Lafayette formed an immediate bond. Washington was 45 years old, a Virginia planter and experienced military commander. Lafayette was 19, a French aristocrat with more enthusiasm than military experience. But Washington saw in Lafayette a brave and dedicated young man who genuinely believed in the American cause. Lafayette saw in Washington a father figure, someone who could fill the void left by his own father's death. Washington treated Lafayette with affection and respect, and Lafayette responded with unwavering loyalty and devotion. Their relationship transcended the military hierarchy. They became like father and son, bound together by mutual respect and shared commitment to American independence. In August 1777, Lafayette accompanied Washington to observe British troop movements. At the Battle of Brandywine in September 1777, Lafayette received his baptism of fire. During the battle, Lafayette was shot in the leg while rallying American troops who were retreating before a British advance. Despite his wound, Lafayette refused to leave the field until he had helped organize an orderly withdrawal. Washington was impressed by Lafayette's courage under fire and his leadership abilities. After recovering from his wound, Lafayette rejoined Washington's army. He spent the brutal winter of 1777 and 1778 with Washington and the Continental Army at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. That winter was one of terrible suffering for the American soldiers. They lacked adequate food, clothing, and shelter. Thousands of men died from disease, exposure, and starvation. Lafayette shared the hardships of the common soldiers, earning their respect and affection. At Valley Forge, Lafayette became part of Washington's inner circle of trusted advisors. He participated in councils of war and helped plan military strategy. Lafayette also used his connections in France to lobby for French support for the American cause. He wrote letters to French officials and to his influential friends at the French court, urging them to provide military and financial assistance to the Americans. In May 1778, Lafayette led American forces in a successful reconnaissance mission at Barren Hill, where he skillfully extracted his outnumbered troops from a British trap. In the spring of 1778, France officially entered the war as an ally of the United States. The French alliance transformed the Revolutionary War from a colonial rebellion into a global conflict. French military forces, naval power, and financial resources provided crucial support to the American cause. Lafayette played an important role in facilitating cooperation between French and American forces. His fluency in both languages and his personal connections to both Washington and the French court made him an invaluable liaison between the two allies. In 1779, Lafayette returned to France to advocate for increased French support for America. He was received as a hero in Paris. Despite having defied royal orders to go to America, Lafayette was now celebrated for his service to the American cause. King Louis XVI pardoned Lafayette and promoted him to the rank of colonel in the French army. Lafayette met with French ministers and military leaders, urging them to send more troops and supplies to America. His efforts contributed to France's decision to dispatch a large military expedition to support the Americans. Lafayette returned to America in April 1780, bringing news that French troops would soon arrive. Washington gave Lafayette command of a division of Continental Army soldiers. In 1781, Lafayette was sent to Virginia to oppose British forces under the command of Benedict Arnold, the American general who had turned traitor and was now fighting for the British. Lafayette conducted a skillful campaign against British forces in Virginia, using mobility and deception to compensate for his numerical inferiority. He shadowed the British army commanded by Lord Cornwallis, harassing British foraging parties and preventing Cornwallis from achieving his objectives. Lafayette's operations in Virginia helped set the stage for the decisive American victory at Yorktown. In the summer of 1781, Washington learned that a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse would be sailing to the Chesapeake Bay. Washington and the French commander Rochambeau decided to march their combined forces south to trap Cornwallis's army at Yorktown. Lafayette's troops in Virginia prevented Cornwallis from escaping inland. In September 1781, Washington's army arrived at Yorktown and began siege operations. Lafayette commanded one of the 3 divisions in the siege. On October 14, 1781, Lafayette's division participated in the assault on British fortifications that sealed Cornwallis's fate. 5 days later, on October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered his entire army. The British defeat at Yorktown effectively ended major combat operations in the Revolutionary War. Lafayette had played a crucial role in achieving American independence. After Yorktown, Lafayette returned to France in December 1781. He was celebrated throughout France as the hero of 2 worlds. Lafayette had fought for liberty in America, and he brought back to France the revolutionary ideals of equality and representative government. In France, Lafayette became an advocate for political reform and individual rights. He pushed for religious tolerance, the abolition of slavery, and constitutional limits on royal power. Lafayette became a symbol of the Enlightenment ideals that were transforming Western political thought. He maintained a close correspondence with Washington and other American leaders. Lafayette sent Washington gifts, including a key to the Bastille, which Washington displayed proudly at Mount Vernon. Lafayette named his son Georges Washington Lafayette in honor of his mentor and friend. When the French Revolution began in 1789, Lafayette was positioned to play a leading role. He was elected to the Estates General, the French legislative assembly that King Louis XVI convened to address France's financial crisis. Lafayette became a leader of the moderate reformers who wanted to transform France into a constitutional monarchy similar to Britain. In July 1789, after the storming of the Bastille, Lafayette was appointed commander of the National Guard, the citizen militia of Paris. He designed the tricolour cockade that became the symbol of revolutionary France, combining the red and blue of Paris with the white of the monarchy. Lafayette drafted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, modeled on the American Declaration of Independence and the Virginia Declaration of Rights. The Declaration proclaimed that all men are born free and equal in rights, and it established the principles of liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression as natural and imprescriptible rights. Lafayette sent a copy to Washington, who congratulated him on this charter of French liberty. Lafayette tried to steer a moderate course during the early years of the French Revolution, but France was becoming increasingly radicalized and violent. As commander of the National Guard, Lafayette was responsible for maintaining order in Paris. In October 1789, Lafayette protected the royal family when an angry mob marched on the Palace of Versailles. He escorted King Louis and Queen Marie Antoinette back to Paris, where they were essentially held as prisoners. Lafayette tried to preserve constitutional monarchy and prevent the revolution from descending into chaos and bloodshed. But Lafayette's moderate position satisfied neither the royalists who wanted to preserve the old regime nor the radicals who wanted to completely overthrow the monarchy and aristocracy. In 1791, Lafayette's reputation was damaged when he ordered the National Guard to fire on radical demonstrators at the Champ de Mars, killing dozens of people. Lafayette was accused of being a tool of the monarchy and an enemy of the people. In 1792, as France went to war against Austria and Prussia, Lafayette was given command of one of the French armies. But Lafayette's military position became untenable as the revolution became more extreme. The monarchy was overthrown, and radical Jacobins gained control of the government. Lafayette was declared a traitor and ordered arrested. In August 1792, Lafayette fled France to avoid arrest and probable execution. He crossed into Austrian territory, expecting to be treated as a neutral refugee. Instead, the Austrians, who viewed Lafayette as a dangerous revolutionary, imprisoned him. Lafayette spent 5 years in Austrian and Prussian prisons, held in harsh conditions. He was confined in dungeons, denied adequate food and medical care, and separated from news of his family. His wife Adrienne was imprisoned in France during the Reign of Terror and narrowly escaped execution. Lafayette's imprisonment became an international cause célèbre. George Washington and other American leaders lobbied for Lafayette's release, but they were unable to secure his freedom. In 1797, after Napoleon Bonaparte came to power in France, Lafayette was finally released as part of a prisoner exchange. Lafayette returned to France, but he refused to support Napoleon's increasingly authoritarian regime. Lafayette retired to his estate at La Grange, where he lived quietly during the Napoleonic era. He refused offers to serve in Napoleon's government, maintaining his principles even when it meant political isolation. Lafayette remained true to his republican ideals and his belief in constitutional government and individual liberty. After Napoleon's defeat in 1815, the Bourbon monarchy was restored in France. Lafayette returned to political life, serving in the Chamber of Deputies where he was a leader of the liberal opposition. He advocated for constitutional reforms, freedom of the press, and expanded political rights. Lafayette remained a symbol of revolutionary ideals and popular sovereignty. In 1824, Lafayette accepted an invitation to visit the United States. His tour of America became a triumphant celebration. Lafayette visited all 24 states, traveling more than 6,000 miles over 13 months. Everywhere Lafayette went, he was greeted by enormous crowds who honored him as the hero of the American Revolution. Lafayette met with President James Monroe, visited Thomas Jefferson at Monticello, and spent time with other surviving leaders of the Revolutionary era. The highlight of Lafayette's visit was his reunion with his old friend and mentor George Washington's family at Mount Vernon. Lafayette was deeply moved by the affection and gratitude that Americans showed him. Congress voted to give Lafayette a gift of $200,000 and a township of land in recognition of his service to American independence. Lafayette's visit to America reinforced his status as the symbol of the enduring friendship between France and the United States. When Lafayette returned to France in 1825, he continued his political activities, supporting liberal causes and opposing the increasingly reactionary Bourbon monarchy. In July 1830, revolution broke out in France once again. The July Revolution overthrew King Charles X and established a constitutional monarchy under Louis-Philippe. The 72-year-old Lafayette once again commanded the National Guard during the Revolution. He helped ensure a peaceful transition of power and endorsed Louis-Philippe as the new king. Lafayette hoped that Louis-Philippe would govern as a true constitutional monarch, but he became disillusioned as the new regime proved less liberal than he had hoped. Lafayette resigned from the National Guard in December 1830, ending his public career. Lafayette spent his final years at La Grange, surrounded by his family and visited by admirers from around the world. He remained interested in political affairs and continued to advocate for republican government and individual liberty. On May 20, 1834, the Marquis de Lafayette died in Paris at the age of 76. Lafayette was buried in Picpus Cemetery in Paris under soil from Bunker Hill that his son had brought from America, symbolically uniting Lafayette with the American cause he had served. Lafayette's death was mourned in both France and America. President Andrew Jackson ordered that Lafayette be accorded the same funeral honors that had been given to George Washington. Throughout America, memorial services celebrated Lafayette's contributions to American independence. Lafayette's legacy endures as the hero of two worlds, a man who dedicated his life to the principles of liberty, equality, and representative government. He fought for American independence and helped establish the United States as an independent nation. He championed revolutionary ideals in France and worked throughout his life to advance constitutional government and individual rights. Lafayette's friendship with George Washington symbolized the alliance between France and America that made American independence possible. Lafayette embodied the Enlightenment ideals that transformed the Western world in the late 18th century. His life demonstrated that dedication to principle and willingness to sacrifice for ideals could change history. Lafayette remains a symbol of the universal human aspiration for freedom and self-government, a reminder that the struggle for liberty transcends national boundaries and connects people across continents and generations. Ethan Allen was a frontier warrior and revolutionary firebrand who became one of the most colorful figures in American history. Ethan Allen, the legendary leader of the Green Mountain Boys, was born in Litchfield, Connecticut on January 21, 1738. He came from a family of modest means. He had a commanding physical presence. Allen's land holdings in the New Hampshire grants would become the source of great controversy. He received only the most basic formal education before his father's death in 1755 forced him to take on adult responsibilities. Then in 1762, seeking opportunity on the frontier, the 24-year-old Allen moved to the disputed territory that would become Vermont, where he would make his name and his fortune. Ethan Allen was a land speculator who acquired thousands of acres in the Green Mountains. In 1770, when New York authorities began challenging land titles granted by New Hampshire in the disputed territory, Allen organized a militia force to defend the settlers' claims. Allen led the Green Mountain Boys in the early 1770s when he was defending the rights of New Hampshire grant holders. He commanded a paramilitary organization that used intimidation and violence to resist New York's jurisdiction. After New York officials attempted to enforce their authority, he became increasingly defiant. In 1774, Allen was declared an outlaw by the colonial government of New York and a price was put on his head, but he continued his resistance from the mountains. Allen was elected Colonel Commandant of the Green Mountain Boys. He began to see the struggle against New York as part of a larger fight for liberty and self-determination. The American colonies felt that Britain, their mother country, was imposing unjust authority and not giving them the freedom they deserved to govern themselves. Ethan Allen was not a cautious moderate or a political theorist like some of the founding fathers. He was a man of action, bold and impulsive, who embraced the revolutionary cause with characteristic enthusiasm. In April 1775, when news reached the Green Mountains that war had broken out at Lexington and Concord, Allen saw an opportunity. Allen was literally the man on horseback who rode north with his Green Mountain Boys ready to strike the first offensive blow of the Revolutionary War. In May 1775, Allen's militia captured Fort Ticonderoga from the British. Allen and his men crossed Lake Champlain under cover of darkness on May 10, 1775. Ethan Allen was a daring commander when he demanded the surrender of Fort Ticonderoga. He was using surprise and audacity to achieve it, and the small British garrison was not expecting the attack. Allen reportedly demanded the fort's surrender in the name of the Great Jehovah and the Continental Congress, though the exact words remain disputed. The capture of Fort Ticonderoga was a stunning propaganda victory for the American cause. Allen also seized the nearby fort at Crown Point, securing valuable artillery that would later be transported to Boston. But following this triumph came a series of setbacks for the impetuous commander. Allen's attempt to capture Montreal in September 1775 ended in disaster. Ethan Allen was captured by the British and spent nearly 3 years as a prisoner of war, enduring harsh conditions aboard prison ships and in various jails. Allen's imprisonment was a test of his legendary toughness. That long captivity, those years in chains and confinement, they were a crucible that only strengthened his resolve. Allen's reputation was all about surviving and never surrendering his spirit. Allen was exchanged for a British prisoner in May 1778, and he returned to a hero's welcome in the Green Mountains. In 1779, with the war continuing, Allen was promoted to general in the Vermont militia. Vermont had declared itself an independent republic in 1777, separate from both New York and the other colonies. Allen became the most prominent advocate for Vermont's independence and statehood. Allen led the political struggle to gain recognition for Vermont, serving in various governmental roles. Allen was the voice of Vermont, negotiating with Congress, corresponding with other revolutionary leaders, and even conducting controversial secret negotiations with the British in Canada, ostensibly to protect Vermont's interests. Allen's negotiations with the British were a complex game of frontier diplomacy. Some historians view these talks as a pragmatic attempt to leverage Vermont's position, while others see them as bordering on treason. Allen always maintained he was working to secure Vermont's future. Throughout the 1780s, Allen worked tirelessly to establish Vermont as a legitimate political entity. He wrote prolifically, including his memoir of captivity and his controversial philosophical treatise. Ethan Allen was also a religious freethinker who challenged Orthodox Christianity. In 1784, he published Reason, the Only Oracle of Man, one of the first American texts promoting deism and rational religion. The book was controversial and earned Allen condemnation from religious leaders. Allen argued that reason, not revelation, should guide human belief. He rejected traditional Christian doctrines like the Trinity and original sin. For a frontier warrior to publish such philosophical arguments was remarkable and showed the breadth of Allen's ambitions. Allen's personal life was as colorful as his public career. He married Mary Brownson in 1762, and they had 5 children together. Mary died in 1783, and Allen remarried in 1784 to Frances Montresor Brush Buchanan, a young widow. Allen settled on his farm in Burlington, Vermont, where he lived as a gentleman farmer and elder statesman. He continued to be involved in Vermont politics and land speculation. Allen's property holdings grew as Vermont developed. He was a founding father of Vermont, though the state would not be admitted to the Union until 1791, after his death. Allen understood that for Vermont to survive as an independent entity, it needed strong leadership and clear principles. He had to set the example of a leader who would fight for his people's rights against any authority, whether New York, Britain, or Congress itself. Allen's vision was of a Vermont that was self-governing and free. He believed in the rights of settlers and the importance of local control. His democratic instincts were genuine, even if his methods were sometimes questionable. Ethan Allen was a man of contradictions. He was a rough frontiersman who wrote philosophical treatises. He was a fighter who negotiated with enemies. He was a champion of liberty who could be ruthless with opponents. He was celebrated as a hero and denounced as an outlaw. Allen's legacy is complex because the man himself was complex. He embodied the spirit of the American frontier, that mixture of violence and idealism, pragmatism and principle. The Green Mountain Boys under Allen's leadership became legendary. They were farmers and hunters who could fight like soldiers when needed. They represented a new kind of American military force, not professional soldiers but citizen warriors defending their homes and rights. Allen understood how to lead such men. He shared their hardships and spoke their language. He was one of them, even as he led them. His leadership style was personal and direct, based on respect earned through courage and shared sacrifice. Allen's writings reveal a man of considerable intellectual ambition. His narrative of his captivity was widely read and went through multiple editions. He described his treatment as a prisoner with vivid detail and bitter humor. Allen portrayed himself as defiant even in chains, never bowing to British authority. Whether the portrait was entirely accurate or partly self-mythologizing, it captured how Allen wanted to be remembered. His philosophical work was less successful commercially but showed his engagement with Enlightenment ideas. The question of Vermont's status consumed much of Allen's later years. Vermont operated as an independent republic for 14 years, longer than Texas would later. Allen worked to maintain Vermont's autonomy while also seeking admission to the United States on favorable terms. The negotiations were complicated by Vermont's disputed borders and by the competing interests of New York and New Hampshire. Allen had to balance Vermont's need for recognition against his own desire to maintain its independence. Allen's secret communications with the British in Canada during the early 1780s remain controversial. He met with British officials and discussed various scenarios for Vermont's future. Some of these scenarios involved Vermont remaining neutral or even aligning with Britain. Allen's defenders argue he was bluffing, using the threat of British alliance to pressure Congress into recognizing Vermont. His critics suggest he was genuinely willing to abandon the American cause if it served Vermont's interests. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. What is clear is that Allen always put Vermont first. His loyalty was to the Green Mountains and the people who settled there, not to abstract principles or distant governments. This localism was typical of the Revolutionary era, when state and regional identities were often stronger than national identity. Allen was a Vermonter before he was an American. He fought for American independence because it served Vermont's interests, not out of ideological commitment to a unified nation. Allen's relationship with other revolutionary leaders was complicated. He corresponded with figures like George Washington and John Hancock, but he was never part of the inner circle of the revolution. He was too independent, too unpredictable, too much his own man. The Continental Congress appreciated the propaganda value of Ticonderoga's capture but was wary of Allen himself. His unauthorized attempt to take Montreal and his later negotiations with the British only confirmed their doubts. Yet Allen remained popular with common people. His story resonated with farmers and frontiersmen who saw in him a reflection of their own struggles and aspirations. He was a self-made man who challenged established authority. He spoke plainly and acted boldly. He embodied a certain American type, the frontier individualist who bows to no one. This image, carefully cultivated by Allen himself, ensured his place in American mythology. The capture of Fort Ticonderoga remained Allen's greatest military achievement. It was the first offensive American victory of the Revolutionary War and provided crucial artillery for the siege of Boston. The psychological impact was enormous, showing that American forces could successfully attack British positions. Allen's bold action helped set the tone for the war. It demonstrated that the conflict would not be merely defensive but that Americans would carry the fight to the enemy. Allen's years as a prisoner tested him severely. He was held in various locations, including the notorious prison ships in New York Harbor. Conditions were brutal, with inadequate food, disease, and harsh treatment. Many prisoners died in captivity. That Allen survived and emerged unbroken was a testament to his physical and mental toughness. His account of his imprisonment became a powerful piece of revolutionary propaganda, illustrating British cruelty and American resilience. After his release, Allen returned to find Vermont had declared independence in his absence. He threw himself into the work of building the new republic. He served in various capacities, including as a member of the Governor's Council. He helped draft laws and settle disputes. He continued to acquire land and promote settlement. Allen envisioned Vermont as a prosperous agricultural state, populated by independent farmers. His vision was largely realized, though not without conflicts over land titles and political control. Allen's religious views were radical for his time and place. In publishing his Deist Manifesto, he risked his reputation and standing. Many of his supporters were uncomfortable with his attacks on Christianity. The book was poorly received and probably hurt his political effectiveness. But Allen believed in speaking his mind, regardless of consequences. His commitment to reason and free thought was genuine, even if it was impolitic. He refused to conform to expectations when he believed he was right. Allen's second marriage brought him companionship in his later years. Frances was much younger than Ethan, but by all accounts the marriage was happy. They had 3 children together, adding to Allen's family. He enjoyed playing the role of patriarch on his Burlington farm. He entertained visitors with stories of his adventures and held forth on politics and philosophy. He remained vigorous and engaged until near the end of his life. On February 12, 1789, Ethan Allen died suddenly at his home in Burlington. He was only 50 years old. The cause of death was likely a stroke, though accounts vary. His death came just weeks after George Washington was elected as the first president under the new Constitution. Allen did not live to see Vermont admitted to the Union in 1791. When he died, he left behind a complicated legacy of heroism and controversy, achievement and unfulfilled ambition. Allen's funeral was a major event in Vermont. Hundreds attended to pay respects to the man who had done more than anyone to create their state. He was buried in Burlington, though the exact location of his grave was later forgotten and remains uncertain. This obscurity seems fitting for a man who lived on the margins, between civilization and wilderness, between respectability and outlawry, between heroism and infamy. Ethan Allen's place in American history is secure, even if it is not always prominent. He is remembered primarily for the capture of Fort Ticonderoga and for his leadership of the Green Mountain Boys. He represents the frontier spirit of early America, the willingness to fight for freedom and self-determination. He was a larger-than-life figure whose exploits became legendary even in his own time. His story has been told and retold, embellished and mythologized. The real Ethan Allen was more complex than the legend. He was ambitious and sometimes ruthless. He could be crude and violent. His negotiations with the British showed a pragmatism that bordered on cynicism. His treatment of those who opposed his land claims was often harsh. He was not a plaster saint but a flesh-and-blood man with flaws and contradictions. Yet he was also genuinely courageous, a natural leader who inspired fierce loyalty. He fought for what he believed in and never backed down from a challenge. Allen's legacy lives on in Vermont, where he is honored as a founding father. Towns, schools, and landmarks bear his name. His statue stands in the National Statuary Hall in the United States Capitol, representing Vermont. The Green Mountain Boys remain a symbol of Vermont's independent spirit. Allen's vision of Vermont as a place of freedom and opportunity continues to resonate. He helped create not just a state but an identity. In the end, Ethan Allen was even in death a figure of his frontier, a man who lived by his own rules and carved out his own destiny in the American wilderness.